Good morning. It's Pop again, Dennis Murray, and today is Popcast 80, and it's called Nature's Wisdom, Part 30. So it's going to be a little different than usual today. Wait a minute. I almost forgot to bring the mic back. Hold on. At least it's turned on. We're grateful for that. Now it's a little closer. Should have better results. Okay, so today's going to be a little different because of a bunch of things. Um, I was sitting outside this morning having my coffee, and the cicadas were making their beautiful sound, which I just love, I know I told you just recently, because they just remind me so much of August, and it's my birthday month, and it's a good thing. It makes me happy. But also a weird experience that relates back to a few years gone by as well. I have, I don't know what the word statue is. I have a garden statue of a heron, a great blue heron. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but it's a very tall bird with a, pretty good sized body and this enormous long neck and a beak. The beak truly must be this big, gotta be. And it's huge. I mean, it's not just some little delicate thing, to reach underneath a bark and find a mosquito. It's a big sucker. It's wide, and this wonderful creature will eat your goldfish and your koi from your koi pond like you never saw. And of course, it was the case that a few years ago. I used to have a house that had a goldfish pond, and I had some koi in it, and um, it was just incredible to see these beautiful birds come in for a landing. It looked like a 747, and the goldfish pond was pretty close to the house, maybe 10 feet or so. So this enormous creature would come in from time to time, and we just have to sit there and watch it for a moment before we ran out and yelled at it to make it go away. And of course, there were times it came when we weren't home, and it did some real heavy feeding on my goldfish and scared them so bad that they stayed under, out of sight for a long time. Anyway, so I so admire the beauty of this creature, the grace and the power, and are just amazing. And when I grew up, what Rachel Carson warned about was true, that DDT had so weakened the eggshells of birds in general, but but very much so of these large shorebirds, that seeing one was a rare event. And my parents and brothers and sisters and I at the our summer cottage would stop whatever we were doing and stare when a heron or an egret, came and landed on the pier or the area. And so it's always been, a wonderful thing for me to see one, even when it was trying to eat some of my goldfish. Um, so this morning the sun is shining in such a way that the statue I have in the yard cast a shadow um, from the ridge line. And so you'd see the shadow of the rooftop ridge line. And on top of that was the shadow of the heron. And it was just old days, old thoughts, wonderful morning. I was quite happy about it. So, I was stirred. And at the same time, I was very stirred by what happened to me yesterday. In the middle of talking to you about um, uh, uh, the shadow, I, for the first time in reading and thinking about the shadow, and for many, many years now, saw it as a natural product of the rapid change in our idea about how to live the gift of each other, that's been brought about by the huge change in the number of each others there are to live with, that's occurred in the past 15,000 years or so, and the huge changes in the rest of our psychology that have occurred as well during this time period. And I just really hadn't seen the shadow as part of our gifts. I saw it as, something Jung talked about is, a part of the darkness that lives within each one of us. And, now I realize, at least in the middle of talking with you yesterday, for the first time, it occurred to me that, wait a minute, this thing is actually appropriate. We're supposed to have this because our physical evolution still is sounding the old ways. And our cultural evolution has left the old ways to a large degree. And there's a conflict. So we want to live the gift of each other in our new ways. That's where our fellow humans and we feel that we want to be. And yet, our older, deeper psychology, which hasn't physically evolved, is calling to us to live the old ways. And we're kind of ashamed to hear that call from within us. Um, and that call from the old ways is what we speak of as shadow. Um, in that light, shadow is part of our gifts in part because it means that somehow we've been able to make incredible changes in a scarce few thousand years in how we conceive each other and how we treat each other. And these are fantastic improvements because they greatly extend the altruism of us uh, beyond its prior limits, so that us is becoming much larger and them is becoming much smaller. And this has to be a good thing. Altruism is better than meanness. That's our every part of our psychology is screaming that. The even the part that still says, well, let's be mean to some people on some occasion, that part earned its way there in ancient times when there was nobody around. And so when somebody showed up, it was quite risky. It is probably a raid, to kill us or steal our food or our women or all of the above. So, the continuance of that part in us is healthy. It's to be understood, to be accepted. Um, but the incredible development of our capacity to live the gift of each other so much more generously in so much more widespread context. It's nothing short of miraculous, in my opinion, this morning. And I was sitting there trying to figure out, what the meaning of, yesterday was to me and to, the way I present things. And wow, I was just really struck by this, that shadow is part of our gifts because it makes us aware of this big conflict from the rapid change in our hearts about how we want to live the gift of each other. And you do a better job of managing a conflict if you're aware of it. And it's helped us appreciate that it's really a miracle that our species has been able to have this kind of change and still function. Uh, and it's only possible because of culture. Essentially, culture is nothing but our personal wisdom sorted through collective experience and time, so that it becomes culture instead of personal wisdom. We still have our personal wisdom, but we also have the culture, which is essentially the wisdom of those that have gone before us, um, and with whatever contribution we can make to it now. Well, but one of the things that culture includes is all of religion, as well as all of philosophy and um, our capacity for science and you know ethics and morality. These things arise from within us, and it's strange because culture, religion feels like it's given to us by an external God, but it seems to me that it arises from the awe in our psychology, and that our experience of that all seems to be universal. And our interpretation of that all is that, oh, well, there's a creed of goodness, and we'll personify it, call it God. And it feels like it exists outside us and it's telling us things. So we write down sacred writings. But it does appear that our capacity to be aware of the feeling that there is or might be an external God is arising from our psychological abilities to feel awe. And so really, religion arises from our psychology, from awe. And it may well, of course, believe me, I have no problem with this. It may well, of course, be that an external God made us have awe in our psychology by the process of evolution, so that we would eventually discover the external God and know who to say thank you to. But the point I'm making today is that the fact that this incredible change that's occurred in 15,000 years has been able to be dealt with to the degree that it has, and on balance, you know, when you consider the task, a reasonable approach has been made to the task, and some successes have occurred, and we're still at the task. We haven't given up. We haven't destroyed ourselves. We haven't been defeated, and we haven't turned on each other in terror. We've managed to live together much better than you could think would be possible after nearly 2 million years of being very, very different, and 15,000 years of total change from everything that you've evolved to be. Is like, are you kidding me? You could actually survive this? You could really grow and enrich your lives and take heart from the awe inside you and produce religious beliefs from it, and use those along with our personal wisdom filtered through the passage of time and hard experience to come up with culture, and use that as a tool to help us survive, even though our changed circumstances are totally contradictory to what we had evolved to think we should be living like. Yeah, that's a miracle. That's the way it feels to me. And I just have felt it so strongly this morning. I thought, I know it still relates somewhat to shadow, and shadow is what I was talking about yesterday. But, it's a pretty stepping back from shadow and putting shadow in a much larger context. Um, but that's, where my thoughts are today. And I've been working for some hours already this morning, to try and put my thoughts down. And I did some reading, and, I'm going to develop a bit of the facts. I just want to share a few things. One of the things I was reading this morning was a book called Living with the Devil by a very prominent Westerner, Stephen Batchelor, who is very well known in Buddhist circles, has spent his entire adult life writing about Buddhism. And one of the things that set off my train of thought was he has a thing in the front here that's a quote from, and it's overly intellectual. I will tell you that was my reaction to it immediately. But this guy is sincerely intellectual, and it helped me discover, it helped me clarify my own thoughts that I'm trying to approach my own work and how I talk to you about my work, not from an intellectual point of view, but from common sense and dragging up as many facts as I can find that seem to help. And so now I'm going to read this quote. This is Blaise Pascal, and he was a French philosopher in the blank century. I'm supposed to know these things, but I claim senior moment for most of the facts I'm supposed to remember. Okay, I do not know who put me in the world, nor what the world is, nor what I am myself. I am in a terrible ignorance about everything. I do not know what my body is, or my senses, or my soul, or even that part of me which thinks what I am saying, which reflects on itself and everything, but knows itself no better than anything else. I see the terrifying spaces of the universe enclosing me, and I find myself attached to one corner of this expanse without knowing why I have been placed here rather than there, or why the life allotted me should be assigned to this moment rather than to another in all the eternity that preceded and will follow me. I see only infinity on every side, enclosing me like an atom or a shadow that vanishes in an instant. Now, okay, so you could think about this stuff at great length. Run the tape back and listen to it 4 times. The guy has something to say. It's just that what struck me about it was the intellectual tone of it. And, I grew up that way. So I would have loved it. But happily for me, I began to develop some appreciation of common sense. And the point is, I'm reading this at breakfast with the cicadas and the heron, etc. And I told you I do most of my research on Wikipedia and Google, but I kind of lied. I also read a lot of this kind of stuff, pretty heavy books. I have a stack of 150 or so of them over here on the floor that I took out of my bookcase, so it wouldn't look so full. And they're the ones actually I'm rereading to get ideas for these podcasts. And I have another, I think I had 900 books on Kindle. And I sorted through and found about 225 of them that seem to have some relevance to the whole stuff of these podcasts. So I'm going through them, skim reading them and writing notes and, so yeah, okay. So I do some other stuff than Google and Wikipedia, but I kind of like to take whatever I read and pitch it in terms that we can all connect with. And common sense is as good a phrase as any, and so I find a lot of ideas from science, and I steal the ones I like, and I don't make any bones that I cherry pick. I'm just looking for stuff that fits in my pre-established views. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a scholar. And And it took me a long time to find a point of view, but having found it, I'm not going to waste time with, looking further. I'm trying to pitch the one I found. So I use context a lot because I think context helps us see things differently. We're in the midst of a great divide. We want to try to get out of it. We want to get to the middle. Context gives us a lot of help. Comparison, comparison is useful. It's why we have to die, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to compare life to, and we wouldn't realize its value to us. Um, and Not my favorite comparison, but still, you have to honor comparison. It's pretty good stuff. Threads of history of our species that led us here. Yeah, I really think looking at evolution and all the processes we can identify in our psychology from people like Jung. Um, and I decided, some while back that I would frame everything from the point of view of psychology. That I start with the sense of awe that's in our psychology as our primary intuition that we all share and that we all interpret differently, which is why we don't all see things the same way. And the gift of each other, but also in terms of the things that all the sacred literature have had to deal with about ourselves and try to find some reasonable response to death, hate, necessity, and the unfairness of the universe that we see that we see in the universe from time to time, and that makes us nervous. Because our total view of the universe is that it's creative goodness at work. So how's this unfairness fit in is the problem. Um, so this is what hit me yesterday when I the saw this notion, new notion of shadow as part of our gifts, and I didn't frame it exactly that way yesterday. That's how I decided to think of it this morning. So a little facts, my kids, who are very kind and loving and supportive. I guess I'm a little bit of a character, and they do poke fun at me from time to time, and so they keep saying, examples, Pop, give examples. They do a lot of good. Um, so the rapid change. So 15,000 years ago, we lived in small groups, 19, 20, 25 people, and we rarely ever had much to do with other groups, and we were very suspicious of them. And there were a couple of million humans, 4, 5, 7 million. It's kind of hard to say. There weren't many, and they were scattered all over the globe, and they didn't have much to do with each other. And then at the time of Christ's birth, 2,000 years ago, there might have been 150 to 200 million people in the whole globe. In the year 1800, there were about 1 billion people. And in 1927, there were about 2 billion. And now there's about 8 billion, this according to the UN, agency that's in charge of these kind of things. Now, there's always some room for argument about these numbers, the dates and the times, etc. But you get the idea. I was born in 42, and so scarcely 15 years before I was born, there were 2 billion people in the world, and now there's 4 times that many. I mean, it's just hard to imagine. Our country was scarcely born in 1800, and at that time there were 1 billion people, and now there's 8 times that many. Uh, you know, there's some differences so huge you just can't imagine how you could ever possibly adjust to them. Um, And the the thing about us humans is that we are far and away the most complex, complicated, and dangerous thing that we humans have to deal with. Each other is both wonderful and threatening at the same time to a degree beyond anything else. I mean, it didn't take us long to figure out how to deal with lions and tigers. I mean, you know, they they look pretty fierce, but as soon as we started to organize, it wasn't a contest, and our capacity to pursue game. So deer and such, and antelopes and all of those things that are faster than lickety split. They can only do lickety split for a little bit, whereas we can pursue on foot at our pace without losing track of the animal for 4 days. And sooner or later, the poor thing is going to give up. So that, we really didn't have much trouble with the natural world. Now, of course, since we started digging up uranium, it turns out that stuff is pretty poison. But even before that, back in the Middle Ages, we, of course, who doesn't love color? But color is actually not so easy to create. So we went to a lot of trouble to dye clothes. And in the process, we had used a lot of really nasty materials to make it happen. And we caused a lot of harm. And then, when we started mining, we brought up lead um, and we exposed the earth to being polluted from things that it normally experiences on the surface in a little tiny degree here and there, and about minuscule amounts per cubic yard. But we congregated them all together in a lot of amounts per cubic yard, and collected together like that, they're a lot more dangerous. So we, the ones that make the natural world more dangerous to ourselves than it was to start with. And we really didn't have too much trouble with managing the natural world, except for the stupid stuff we've done to ourselves because we didn't know better. But we've always had a lot of trouble managing each other because we're so complicated and we're so powerful and we're so clever and able to organize. And there's nothing like 7 guys with bows and arrows to frighten the crap out of 3 guys with stone hammers. So the point is that this change isn't just a change of numbers. It's it's a change of numbers of very threatening, clever, dangerous, and wonderful other people. And that's a whole different kind of change. It's a lot more frightening, and it would be very easy to imagine that at some early stage in this change, we would have collapsed as a species. Our inability to deal with each other in such large numbers, as complex and difficult as that is, could have failed to develop. And essentially, the only reason we can sustain large population is because we organize cleverly and we figure out cleverly how to manipulate the natural world so that we can feed, a couple of million people off a piece of land that 10,000 years ago they couldn't have fed 10 people off. And so, the part of our gifts has made us have more troubles, more people, and people can be trouble. So, like I was saying yesterday, you can go broke getting rich. The troubles that happen as things change for the better can stop things from changing for the better and make them worse. Um, so it's really a minor miracle, more than a minor miracle. It's really a big miracle that we were able to invent the we were able to find enough wisdom in ourselves individually and collectively so as to create religion and culture to help us manage all of this change. And in that light, then our appreciation of our differences in the Great Divide changes quite a bit. I got a 2-page note here, and I only display one page, and I'm going to have to look at my notes here, page 2. Um, so a couple of things. Part of our Great Divide is religious differences, but it seems to me that the great majority of the religious differences fits into two categories that can be relatively easily understood in the circumstances. One is whether faith is an intuition or a fact. And, so faith arises from our psychology. To me, it's an intuition. Uh, and it allows me to believe that there is an external creative goodness at work in the universe that's uh, reflected in our psychology. But I don't claim that that belief is a fact, something that can be proven in the way that 2 and 2 is 4 can be proven, or the distance to Mars can be proven. Um, it's a strong intuition. I'm grateful to have it. It affects my life. Um, but I never forget that it's an intuition, so it could be wrong. But there are plenty of people for whom faith is a fact, and your suggestion that it's an intuition is fighting words. Um, but that looks like a really big difference. Like, how are we ever going to get past this? And the name calling and the snobby upper noses, and if only you weren't so, fill in a word that's rude. You wouldn't feel, say, or think, or do those things. Um, but actually, it's completely understandable because it feels so much like a fact. I mean, my goodness, our psychology is screaming at us to be grateful for life, and this awe is overwhelming. And it just seems like it must be true externally from us because how else? We didn't really understand beans about our psychology until very recently. Jung's work is only scarcely 100 years old. And, his work was tentative and new. So, I mean, there's plenty in Jung that I personally don't find much use for. Things have moved on. And of course, Jung died 60, 60, yeah, 50 years ago. So, I mean, considering that most of his work is scarcely 100 years old, him being gone 50 years is a big deal. A lot's happened since. Um, and we didn't know beans about the possibility that this sense of awe that gives us, a feeling of there must be a creative goodness, and let's personify it and call it God, that was inside us. How would we know that? We didn't know we had an inside. And so there's that. And the other the other dispute in religion is about whether God is knowable or unknowable. And as a former intellectual, I used to be very convinced that God was ineffable, and I still believe that. That ineffable is a very highfalutin word for who in the hell knows. That you can't really know anything about God, and it is part of every religion's traditions, and for those religions that have dogma, it's typically part of the dogma. It's part of the religious teachings that the deity is unknowable, ineffable. But in fact, in real life, a lot of people get fairly comfortable with their deity, and it becomes more or less a feeling that I know a lot about the deity, by whatever name of God I choose to use. Um, but again, I mean, this is completely understandable. Why wouldn't there be such a difference? Again, our psychology is screaming at us, and we have, especially with the birth of Christ, um, found a very knowable, approachable human who we feel like is also God. And so, understandably, it's a short hop to say, well, I know the human part of Jesus, so I also know a lot about God. And God becomes far less unknowable. And I mean, that's completely understandable. And it should be the case that intellectuals and non intellectuals can see past this difference and say, okay, no need for either one of us to get, our all out of sorts over our differences on this matter. In the light of this point of view, of the incredible change we've had and the necessity for growing our cultural evolution to make uh, change possible, since our physical evolution couldn't possibly keep up with the rate of change. And as a part of our cultural evolution, taking religions and making them far more detailed and complex than they had been, in the time period prior to 15,000 years ago. So the other thing is that cultural evolution is uneven. And this is a very important part of the Great Divide that I think arises from the things we've been talking about shadow and the appreciation of the impact of this incredible quantity of change. Um, so, evolution itself is, as a physical thing, no doubt was uneven, but certainly as a cultural thing, it's understandable that it's quite uneven. This group of people in this time and place may be able to see that third world people are humans way before other people can see that. And that's part of cultural evolution. The seeing, the redefining us to include more people. Um, and redefining the gift of each other, so to see how many others there are that are part of the gift and are part of us and not them. But it's not all going to happen at one time and in one place to everybody. It's not like a thunderclap occurs and suddenly everybody's hearts and minds are healed and full of love and joy. There is some love and joy in all of us, but it takes the form of cultural evolution unevenly. Um, and so this unevenness means there will be at any given time people who still thought, as there certainly were, that slavery was acceptable, and people who were so appalled by it they wanted to go to war over it. And there will be, at the same time, people who see women's role in the world, as full and large and generously as can be, and see very much that the social aspect of having women fully involved in our communities is a rich part of our human evolution. And there are others who, because of the fears involved in the great changes that have occurred in the last 15,000 years, huge fears, found, that, for example, a sense of moral guilt arose, and moral guilt includes sexual matters. So, breaking the bond of a bonded pair became a serious moral, personal failure. And, a lot of people are afraid enough about moral failure, they want to do whatever they can do to keep the possibility of temptation away. So they keep their women locked up in cupboards so that you're only around a woman who's your wife and sexual access isn't a problem. Well, for a lot of people, that didn't work so well, and times changed. But again, the whole point is that one of the big things that divides us is the unevenness of cultural evolution. And when we appreciate that the unevenness is a natural part of cultural evolution, it becomes more part of the less concerning, and we can better see how I want to end that um, gratitude and hope abound. Okay, enough for today. Talk to you tomorrow. Take care. Bye bye.